Good evening, friends. We are here with class number 19, as it happens, of our pilgrimage to Israel, the life of Jesus. As I say every week, this has been one of my favorite classes ever. So I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am. We're coming close to the end of Jesus' life and therefore of this pilgrimage, but we're not quite there yet. So we'll have one more, at least maybe two more wonderful evenings. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to walk in the steps of the great saints and masters, that we may see in the events of their lives, grand and heroic though they may be, the guiding principles that will enable us to follow those footsteps into the infinite light, to walk where they have walked, to realize as they have realized, to live in bliss as the great ones live in bliss. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. Before we start our journey for this evening, I'd like to listen to a song from the oratorio, When Human Hopes. This song is actually performed at the end of the oratorio of Christ's life in music. That's what an oratorio is. But it relates to an event that happened earlier, which was when Jesus appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration and revealed his true form to several of his disciples, Peter and John. We have listened to it in the chronological context of when that took place, but Swamiji also put it here in the oratorio because of the greatness of it. So now we are dealing with the resurrection of Christ, which is the true culmination of his life. So this magnificent song seems very appropriate for us to open this evening.
Dark
So beautiful. So, last week we read out of the Bible for several pages about Jesus' resurrection, and we got as far in the gospel sections to where Jesus had appeared to Mary Magdalene, and she and the other women ran back to tell the other disciples what had happened. But that was not the only time on that Easter day that Jesus appeared. So I want to finish reading all the events of that day. And as I always remind you, I'm reading this combined gospel. So all four gospels are put together in chronological order. So occasionally there's a slight repetition or slight contradiction, but the end result is that we get everything in one place. Now that same day, which was this Easter Sunday, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Two of them, meaning two of those who were followers of Jesus. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. So this is the second time this day that Jesus appears, but he masks his identity from his disciples. When Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, as you recall from what the gospel said, at first she thought he was the gardener. They just throw that little bit in. She thought he was the gardener. Not only did she not know that he was Christ, she just thought he was an ordinary person. And she was weeping, and he said to her, "Why are you weeping?" She said, "They've taken away the Lord, and I don't know where they've put him." And then he called her by her name, and she recognized him. And that was where we ended last time. But so now they're walking along, they're talking about all the things that happened. A seeming stranger joins them, and the stranger asks them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened these days?" I mean, just, you read this and you think, what? It so confounds our idea of how these things are supposed to unfold. So then the stranger said, "What things?" And they replied, "About Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." So now you're hearing, see, what this does, if you want to think about why would such a lila be played out. There's a word in Sanskrit that doesn't exist in English. The word is lila, and it means the play of God. It means the way that God does things that we're not quite understanding, that the only way you can think of it is that God plays with us. He just assumes certain roles for his own reasons. So this is the play of God. But what happens is, here in the gospel, these disciples talk about what this experience was. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. You have to bear in mind that this all happened in the context of the Jewish culture. Within the Jewish culture, within the Essene culture, they were an oppressed and somewhat powerless people within the culture they lived in. They did not have their own rights and privileges except within their small communities. And so they thought the Messiah was going to have an effect on their position in the world. And this is like, it reflects back in a mirror what we all think. Oh, now that I'm a disciple, now that I'm following the ways of God, that now everything in the external world is going to cooperate with my desires, because after all, I'm on God's side now. So even these who are privileged to be direct disciples of Jesus, to be in his company, still imagine that his was a worldly mission. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said Jesus was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. The stranger said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" So now the stranger says, "Are you sure you've understood this correctly? And why is it that you're so agitated and you don't understand?" And then the stranger went on, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. The stranger explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So now Jesus is walking along explaining to them the mission of the Messiah and what it meant and why it was prophesied and why it was fulfilled by his death. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, the day is almost over." So he went into the village to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And this, of course, is what Jesus did at the Last Supper. He picked up bread and he broke it. "Do this in remembrance of me." And he passed the bread out to each of his disciples. So there, this stranger whom they haven't recognized, who they've walked 7 miles with, and they've done nothing but talk about the Messiah. He's sitting at the dinner table. He breaks the bread. He hands the bread to them. And then their eyes opened and they recognized him. And in the moment that they recognized him, he disappeared from sight. Oh my. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" So they now, because the Messiah has done this for them, the veil has fallen off of their understanding, and they realize that even as they walked together, there was a spirit among them that was unique. The masters have this capacity to be recognized or not to be recognized. It comes up often in Autobiography of a Yogi with Babaji. That Babaji can allow you to know who he is or blind you to his identity. And then afterwards you won't even know. There's a story in the little book that I published called Miracles and Loved and Protected, Stories of Miracles and Answered Prayers. It's toward the end of the book, and it was told to me by 2 people who live at Ananda. And they were hiking in a very hot desert area. The man felt that he almost died from heat stroke out there. And at a certain point, they saw a figure sitting on a rock in the bright sun with no protection in this extraordinarily hot desert climate. They had a whole experience of who he was, and only when they got home did it occur to both of them that the figure that they had seen looked and felt exactly like Babaji. Both of them had seen him, and there were unusual circumstances about where he was, how he was sitting, the fact that he seemed to be closer sometimes and farther away at other times. And then, as soon as they turned away, they forgot that they had seen him until they got home. And then they both remembered, and then they both felt that it had been a vision of Babaji. I mean, they just presented it with veracity as their own shared experience. It's a remarkable story, certainly. And in autobiography, there's a number of stories in which even Sri Yukteswar doesn't know at first who Babaji is, because the saints can do this. So for his own reasons, this is how Jesus behaved with these disciples. So the two disciples got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the priests, they found the 11 disciples, and there with them assembled together and saying, and the two men now are testifying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Peter." This is what the disciples are saying to each other. In the commentary on these Gospels, it says, it's never described in the Bible when Peter appeared to Jesus. We know that Peter appeared to Mary Magdalene. That Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene and that Jesus appeared to these two disciples. But when the disciples are gathered together in a locked room for fear that they would be the next to be arrested, they're saying to each other, "The Lord has risen and has appeared to Peter," Simon Peter, they called him. So we don't know when or how that happened, but the disciples are now saying it. So he not only appeared to the women, but he also appeared to Peter. Then the two disciples who had been walking with Jesus but didn't know it, told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So Swamiji makes a point here about how, this has been a remarkable series of days. Jesus is arrested, is crucified, dies, is placed in the tomb. The next morning, the tomb is empty. He appears to several of the disciples. Several of them can now say, "Jesus has appeared to me," but they still don't know what has happened, why this is going on, what the result of all this is. But Master and Swami, they make a point of the fact that the disciples gathered together. They were afraid that they might be arrested. They were afraid that they would meet the same terrible death that Jesus had met. But still, they looked to each other for support. In other words, they did not repudiate their discipleship, but rather gravitated to each other to get the strength of their shared faith in Jesus in this moment of crisis. Earlier, when Jesus was saying things like, "Eat my body and drink my blood," he was making it difficult so that those who didn't have deep faith would be turned away at that point, because Jesus knew that very soon they would need strength together. So that the fact that they're gathered together was a credit to their discipleship. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Now, when you read the gospel carefully, you realize that it was more than the 11 remaining apostles, because these two other disciples who had been walking on the street and in other places, who knows how many of the women and other disciples were gathered there. The apostles were distinct, but they were not the only ones. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Now here you are again. Here's Jesus resurrecting again. And their first one is slight fear. Is this Jesus himself? Is this a ghost? Is this a vision? Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your minds?" So when Sri Yukteswar resurrected after his death to Master, in autobiography, Master makes a big point about his experience of the complete physicality of Sri Yukteswar. He knelt and touched his feet, the familiar shape of his shoes and of his toes. He hugged him, and there was the odor of the scent, the sort of the characteristic scent that came from Sri Yukteswar's body. the feeling of his physical frame in Master's embrace. So it's not merely that this is a vision that you would put your hand out and you would put your hand through it, but it's an actual reconstruction of the physical body. In Autobiography of a Yogi, where this is discussed in more detail, Sri Yukteswar says that this is a resurrection, a reconstitution of the material atoms that make my physical body. But Sri Yukteswar says to Master, you see it as physical. I don't see it as physical now. I see this as just a collection of energy, but from your perspective in the material world, it manifests as a material thing, just as the body I had before. I have no capacity to sort of interpret that or say anything else, but it's interesting. It's interesting. And here with Jesus, are they seeing a ghost? He said, why are you troubled? Why do doubts arise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is myself. Touch me and see if a ghost does not have flesh and bones. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. So we don't have as complete a reaction as Master gave us, the disciples' point of view, but we do have the experience. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, do you have anything here to eat? It's just, you can't help but laugh a little bit at the whole thing. He's saying, I've really returned. You watched me die. You watched my lifeless body be placed in the tomb. And here it is. My body has been resurrected. Death absolutely did not touch me. This is the third morning after he was placed in the tomb, and they all saw him. They all know that he's there. So then to just show how completely he's returned, he says, do you have something here to eat? So they gave him a piece of boiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. I mean, they themselves must have just, afterwards, just marveled at how he wanted them to know that he had transcended this world in every respect, and he could play with it like anyone would just play with a stone. He said to them, this is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. This is what Jesus said over and over again. I came to fulfill the prophets, not to contradict the scriptures, but to fulfill them. So again and again he's emphasizing. This is also because, you see, he was relating to the reality of his disciples, who were deeply steeped in this tradition of studying the scriptures, of this believing the prophecies. He talked to them that way because that was their orientation. Every master, every avatar brings the exact same state of consciousness, but they adjust the way they express the same truth to meet the needs of the time and, above all, the needs of their disciples. So what would enhance the confidence of their disciples was for him to constantly verify that you have spent your life, generations, studying these scriptures and interpreting these scriptures, and see, you are very familiar with this as the proof of the coming of the Messiah. So let me remind you. So he did. Again, Jesus said, and now we're slightly repeating, now we're in the book of John. Again, Jesus said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. So now we're hearing from John about how Jesus gave them power in that moment. He didn't only appear before them, but he breathed on them. Now, it's not his actual physical breath that had the power, but it's the breath of life. And also, you have to think somewhat esoterically when Master said that Jesus taught them Kriya or something very much like it. And Kriya is the esoteric meditation technique that uses the breath to access the Kundalini, the deepest life force. So when John says, and he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit, then he's giving them much more than breath, physical breath. He's giving them the life force of Christ consciousness above all. Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. When the Bible talks about sin, they're talking about karma. They're talking about vrittis in the spine. They're talking about unlearned lessons. And they're talking about the grace of God through his enlightened children to dissolve our karma, to take the karma upon themselves, or to dissolve it by their grace so that we become free. Later in other places, Master explains that on the day of Pentecost, which was 50 days after Easter morning, Jesus appeared, and that was when the greatest power of the Spirit was put into his disciples. And Master said that by the sacrifice of his physical body, Jesus worked out a lot of karma of his disciples. And then because that karma had been worked out, he was able to give them more than he'd been able to give them before. In the story of Lahiri Mahashaya and his wife, when you read the recollections of Kashi Moni, who was Lahiri Mahashaya's wife, and she talks about how she lived with her husband for many years and did not know who he was. And then one remarkable night, she awoke to the presence of angels, and she had this extraordinary vision of her husband in light, and she fell at his feet and begged his forgiveness for treating him like an ordinary mortal when she could suddenly see that he was a divine being. And Lahiri Mahashaya said to his wife, over these many years, I have been silently working out your karma for you so that you would be able to receive from me as you are now able to receive. There was no dramatic event like crucifixion in the life of Lahiri Mahashaya, but Master said that was precisely what Jesus was doing. And this is where the Catholic dogma the dogma of all Christianity, that Jesus died for our sins, and because of his death on the cross, we are saved. Master said that that's partially true. By the sacrifice of that body, Jesus was able to work out the karma of his disciples at the time. But that crucifixion of that body, it was not the death of that body that paid it forward for all everlasting disciples, but the consciousness of Jesus without a body still had the capacity to work out the karma of his disciples, but not the body. Once the body was gone, that sacrifice was over. So now back to this locked room on this first day. Now Thomas, one of the 12 disciples, was not with the others when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my fingers where the nails were, and put my hand into the wound in his side, I will not believe." And this is where he gets the appellation, Doubting Thomas. All the disciples have seen, but Thomas wasn't there, and he says, "I can't believe unless I see myself." Is this the strength of Thomas or his weakness? It's hard to say, but this is how the story is told. A week later, and see now we're going into, and we'll continue for a little ways here, Jesus actually continued to appear to his disciples for about 40 days. I mean, most people know about Mary Magdalene, who have a superficial, a passing knowledge of Christianity, know about Mary Magdalene, and many know about the disciples in the locked room and Jesus appearing to them, and even this about, I'm going to say, a week later when Jesus came back when Thomas was there. But there are actually many more appearances. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, so the disciples are still holding fast to their commitment to each other and their commitment to Christ. And Thomas was with them this time. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And so Jesus knew exactly what Thomas wanted. That's how this story is told. The door is locked, Jesus appears. He appears in a physical body, but it's a physical body that is not bound by physical laws, even though he says, "Do you have anything to eat? Give me something to eat." So it's all meant just to confound our little ideas of how the world is supposed to be organized and what happens. Thomas said to Jesus, "My Lord and my God." So he obeyed his guru's admonition, stop doubting and believe. Thomas believes. Then Jesus said, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That's a blessing that is going forward, because after this brief moment in time, the rest of us will have to feel it in our hearts. Perhaps we'll be gifted with a vision, but we're not going to be in that moment for that moment of resurrection. So now I'd like to share with you some lovely pictures that are all related to the resurrection of Jesus, going back to the long sections of the Bible that I read last week, but I didn't have time to show these pictures. So let's now go to that part. The first four pictures we saw before when we were placing Jesus in the tomb. So this is the big cathedral, or relatively big church, very old church in Jerusalem that is known as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is the little chapel that was built over the cave that was the place where Jesus was laid after he died on the cross. And as I said last week, and you'll see there's two rooms here, and you can go into those rooms. This is what these people are doing. So this is the outside of the little building. Let's take the next one. And now we're standing right at the doorway looking in, and this is the first room, and there's a rock there that may have been the rock that was rolled aside. I'm not really sure what it is. As you can see, it's very ornate. There's a lot of the Eastern Orthodoxy present in this church, so the decor is of their style. Let's move one more. This is the first little room where you go into the tomb, and you can see the dark opening beyond it. This was a cave, bear in mind, not anything else. Then let's take the next one. And now this is the room where Jesus was laid. There's marble over this, and 4 people at a time can go in and just all day, unless they're having a mass and they've closed it. Pilgrims just go in and out, and a priest lets you stand there for a couple of minutes, just like this. There's marble over all the rock, although you can go to the back of that little edifice, which is under the control of a different sect, and you can actually reach through a small hole and actually put your hand right on the rock. Here you can only touch the marble. And as I was saying before, this is really one of the most magnificent places on the planet to my limited experience, but it's really powerful. So this is the very spot from which Jesus resurrected. So now we're going to go and just look at art. So these are Fra Angelico painting. This is on the wall of the monastery in Florence. This is the angel sitting, as you recall, where Mary Magdalene rushes in with the other women. The tomb is empty. She sees an angel sitting there. And in this artistic rendition, you see that Jesus is standing there, but they don't see him yet. Oh my. Let's take the next one. This again is just another artist's rendition of the women who have come to care for Jesus' body, meeting this beautiful blonde-haired angel who is there telling them, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is risen." Let's take the next. Another just beautiful expression of the women looking in. And this is, of course, gives you more of an idea of what it might have been as a cave. They're looking into the cave. The body is gone. The angel greets them. I mean, this theme has been used countless times, and they're all of them wonderful. Again, let's look at the next picture. This is from the Eastern Orthodox point of view. The angel sitting there. I just, you love the thought of some artist tuning deeply into this extraordinary story and then, putting art to paper and wanting to say what this story means to them in the way that they would see it. And here we have the detail of the winding sheets that Jesus was wrapped in were still there, even though the body was gone, and the headpiece was separate from the body, and that is from the body wrap, because if you had freed your arms, you would lift the part off of your head and set it off to the side. So here we have the separation between the two pieces. Let's do it again. And in this particular one, we have this wonderful detail. Look at the wings of this angel. Just, beautifully colored wings, and the angel's just sitting there. And the women are coming, and they're holding the flasks where they have the perfume and they have the oil. They want to deal with the body, and instead they meet this angel who materializes to talk to them, their spirit being so wonderful. And the artist opens up the cave to just show the whole world behind it. All the expansiveness that this represents. So let's see the next. This is a drawing by Heinrich Hoffmann. I always mention that because the picture of Jesus that is used on most of the altars of Master's disciples is a sketch that Heinrich Hoffmann made, and Master said it looks more like Jesus than most others. So he acknowledged that Hoffmann had some direct intuitive connection. And so this is Mary Magdalene. She's sitting outside the tomb and she's weeping. And Jesus is coming up behind her. This is where the scene took place, where she explains to him why she's weeping. So let's see the next. And this is Mary Magdalene. When she recognizes that it's Jesus, you see the cave stylized behind. These are icons from the Eastern Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. You see again how the winding sheets are in two parts, but that's all that's in the tomb. And it seems to me that Jesus is saying to Mary, "Don't touch me yet," because that was part of the gospel moment. Master explains that. He says, I'm not yet risen. Master said that the 3 days represents the three levels, the physical, the astral, and the causal. I'm only repeating because I don't have any direct understanding. But you have just that little touch where Jesus' hand is out. See, Mary's reaching for him and he's putting his hand out. So this must be that moment in the story. So let's see the next picture. And now we have a very Western picture where Mary is lavish in her costume and Christ looks very Western. And once again, it's the same scene, though. She's reaching for him. He's cautioning her, don't touch me yet. His face is, there's something about this also that's so beautiful. And just think again, an artist, there was nothing. There was just a blank piece, the gospel account, and then the artist felt it so deeply. It takes a long time to paint like that, and he had to keeping every element of it as close as he could to be a representation not merely of a man and a woman, but of an avatar and his devoted disciple. Let's see the next picture. And this is Fra Angelico again. And here's Mary reaching for Jesus. The same separation between them. Just the same sweetness. Now we move to where Jesus appears to his disciples. So the door is closed behind him, and all of a sudden Jesus is there. You see, and there's 11. That one normally thinks of that event as just being the 11 apostles, but when you read the account more carefully in the gospel, you realize that there were a number of others, that these were not the only disciples. And it talks about the women and others being there. But here, in the way they've sort of all drawn back a little bit because they were amazed and they weren't quite sure whether he was a ghost or not. And he's holding his hand up in that mudra, which he often has, meaning peace be unto you. Let's see the next one. Here, Fra Angelico has taken that same setting, but he's put it at the tomb as if Jesus is walking out of the tomb and all the disciples are coming to meet him. And in the corner you see the devil is disappearing off to the left there. There you go. There's and this is just historical trivia that I happen to have read because somebody gave me a book called The Story of Blue, because as a Nayaswami I wear blue all the time, we all do. And it was this incredibly interesting story about how blue used to be a very expensive color to make as a dye, but then they discovered something and they were able to do it easier. The details escape me. But the guilds at that period of time, each guild had a separate color. And the red guild was the most powerful guild, and that's why the royalty wore red and so on like that. And then blue started in. So there was a lot of dispute between the red guild and these upstart blue guild dye people. And the devil had been painted blue for a long time, so the blue guild had a hard time getting traction. And then at some point in all of that, some artist, and I don't know which one, put the Virgin Mary in blue. And once the Virgin Mary was in blue, then blue became a very desirable color for everyone to wear. It's just amazing how these things happen. But here the devil is blue, whereas we usually think of the devil as being red. I'll be all mixed up historically, but it's just the way the human and the divine play together. What I love about this one is look how the disciples are rushing to meet him. You just sort of see a whole horde of auras just rushing to meet Jesus, and you see Jesus reaching out and rushing to meet them. So let's see the next picture. This is another Hoffman picture, and now we're on the road to Emmaus. Here's our two unidentified disciples who are walking out of Jerusalem to this village. They meet this stranger. This is actually set. They've arrived in the town, and they're inviting Jesus to come and spend the night with them. But they don't know who he is at this point. Now the next picture. This is an artist's rendition of them sitting together at supper, visiting their friend, the two travelers. Jesus has bread in his hand. He's just broken it. And so this would be a picture of the moment when they realize who he is just before he disappears. So look at all their faces. They all seem so amazed. And Jesus is just looking at them, holding the bread. Now let's take the last one. And this is another Hoffman drawing. And this is, again, an artist's rendition of Jesus simply walking out of the cave. And what you have there, which is only Hoffman's imagination, which is to say it's not written in the gospel this way, because what you have is the Roman guards who were there to keep the body from being stolen because of the fear that the disciples would steal the body and then claim he was resurrected. So the guards were put in place there. So in this particular story, Jesus himself just emerges from the tomb, and all the guards are overwhelmed by the light and power of his presence. One is covering his face with his hands, another has lifted his shield, the other is turning away, but he keeps his eyes on Jesus. Who's to say? You could, from all of this, you could make up a huge story of everything that happened, which Hoffman, who knows? You know, maybe he felt all of this was true. Maybe the spirits of all of these people came to him. Maybe Jesus is telling him what really happened. So while this picture remains on the screen, we're going to listen to one of the climax songs of the whole oratorio, which is simply Christ is risen. Oh my. For those of you who have ever sung in the oratorio, you know how it comes when that song finally comes. You can really say everything you wanted to say all the way through it. Absolutely magnificent. So now, Christ has risen this Easter morn, and we've gone through appearing to the disciples, appearing to Mary Magdalene, all of that magnificent story. But now Jesus continues to appear. As I said earlier, for about 40 days, Christ continues to appear periodically to different of the disciples. And so here's the next most well-known appearance. Afterward, meaning after he came to the disciples on Easter Day, and after a week later he came to where Thomas was, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. Now, before they were in Jerusalem, and now they've gone to the Sea of Galilee, where they often went to Jesus, which even nowadays is some distance, from Jerusalem. So it's where many of them were from. They had come to Jerusalem for the Passover, but it wasn't their home. So now the Passover is over, which resulted in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. They've gone home to Galilee. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. Here we have this continuing theme, don't we? He shows up, and at first they don't know it. He called to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net out on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. So they'd been fishing all night, had caught nothing. A total stranger from the beach says, "Throw your net out." They throw their net out. Suddenly it's so full of fish they can't even lift it. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, this is from the book of John, and this is how John always calls himself. He defines himself by Jesus' love for him, which is really in itself extraordinary. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," Peter wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. Peter just couldn't even wait for the boat to get in. He just dove over the side. They were not far from shore and began to swim and walk through the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there. With fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish. And I love this in the Bible. Who knows why? 153 fish in the net. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said, "Come here and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This means Jesus was cooking. He was cooking on the rock, and on the rock was a fire of burning coals. He added fish to it. He broke the bread. He cooked the fish. He gave it to the disciples. In other words, he participated with them just as he had when he had been alive. Once again, he's just showing them there is no difference between the way I was then and the way I am now. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Peter, "Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, he calls him Simon, but Simon Peter, son of John, "Do you love me?" And Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The 3rd time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, "Do you love me?" Peter said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Now, of course, if you look back in the gospel, you realize that at the night of the Last Supper, when Jesus was saying that he was going where they couldn't follow, and with great exuberance, Peter said, "There's no place you're going that I can't follow. I will go wherever you tell me to go." And Jesus said, "Really? Because before the cock crows at dawn, 3 times you will say that you don't even know me." And so you remember during that very dramatic night after Jesus was arrested, and Peter followed behind to where he was taken to the Sanhedrin and then taken to Pontius Pilate, 3 times during that night, people said, "Wait, aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter said, "No, not me." So 3 times Peter denied that he knew Christ. So Christ comes now and 3 times said to Peter, "Do you love me?" So of course, it's so obvious. You have to think that whatever karma of doubt and fear Peter had expressed, Jesus is now taking it all back and bringing Peter completely back, into his heart. But it was Peter himself who needed to understand Christ had already known this was going to happen. And this story, feed my sheep, take care of my lambs, Jesus always called himself the shepherd of his flock. And so he's telling Peter, and because of this, many dogmas have been created, that Peter was the first pope and founded the church and all of these different things. However you want to take that is fine, but it's clear that Peter's getting his assignment. He's not being told, go to a cave and commune with me. He's being told to take responsibility for feeding my children with the news of this, of the coming of the Messiah and his saving power. Now Jesus says to Peter, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to Peter, "Follow me." And in fact, Peter was crucified, just as Jesus was crucified, although Peter himself added a very dramatic touch because Peter had himself crucified upside down because he felt he was not worthy to die in the same way that Jesus had died. So, follow me. So now Jesus has asked him, "Do you love me?" He has given him his commission to take care of all those who have been drawn to Jesus, but he has told Peter that you will have to follow me all the way into the same death that I suffered. And Peter did. Peter did exactly what Jesus asked him to do. So, as aspiring devotees, we can read this over and over again. Peter knew what the end of his story would be, but from that moment on, unhesitatingly, he did everything he could to serve Jesus. And the Acts of the Apostles, which is the addendum which comes later, just describes, all the different ways. And the final suffering and death that most of the disciples endured, including Peter. Peter then turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" Which is to say, John. When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that that particular disciple, John, would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" And John was not martyred. John died a natural death. He was exiled, he was persecuted, but he was not martyred as Peter was martyred. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down, and we know that his testimony is true. So that's how that portion of the gospel ends. And so now I want to show you some pictures, because the place where this part of the story took place is also one of the really remarkable places in the story of Jesus and in the pilgrimage that you can take if you go to Israel. So this is the Sea of Galilee. Earlier on we saw some pictures also of the Sea of Galilee. This is a place called Tabga, and well worth remembering. When we talked about the Sea of Galilee before, we talked about the fact that much of it is not developed. So you're still just walking on beach and looking at rocks. It's not like old Jerusalem where everything is now completely occupied in a different way. So this view of the Sea of Galilee is likely to be very much like what Jesus and his disciples saw when they were there. Let's take the next picture. Another view of, you can see the far distance, you get an idea of the scope of the lake, really. It's also called the Lake of Tiberias, and that's a rocky shore that you can walk along. Now let's go to the beginning. There is on the shore at this place where Jesus is said to have appeared, there's a wonderful stone chapel, which we'll see in a moment, coming in from the street. If you were on pilgrimage, you walk down this beautiful walkway, and we're heading, you can just barely see it at the end. It's not a long walk. We're heading for this beautiful chapel. Let's see the chapel now. Sea of Galilee behind it, this beautiful small rocky church. And this church is built over the rock where Jesus fried the fish. But let's see another view of the chapel. First, this is from the outside. Here's the beach, just right next to it. The water is not far away, and depending on how high the tide is, the water is really quite close to the chapel. So the chapel being built over the rock where Jesus fried fish, you can see it's all right here, and you can see how very natural it all still is. Let's see the next picture. Again, just a view of how close the sea is, where the rocks are, the walkway ends. You just walk by. You can walk right into the water and just feel every bit of it as it was when he was there. Let's go another moment. This is an artist's picture of the disciples gathering the fish, Peter having walked into the water, Christ on the rock, greeting them. Now let's go back inside the chapel. And this big rock here, and they call it the table of Christ. The words in Latin there means the table of Christ. The whole chapel, you can see, is quite tiny, and it's all simply built around this rock. So let's go a little closer to the rock. You can reach right through all of that and just put your hands on the table of Christ. Just look at it. Imagine a coal fire, smoking fire, little bits of fish, a loaf of bread set next to it, Jesus standing next to the rock asking, let's add more fish to the fire, all of it just being open as we could see, just on the beach to the water. The boat is going to be just a few yards away from where we're standing. Let's go closer still. There we are to the rock, and I look at things in that little plastic basket. They always put little baskets out just like that, just to collect donations. I once made the mistake of moving one aside for the photograph, but the priest got really upset with me, so I never did that again. But you can just sit just right there. Put your hands, put your head right on the rock where Jesus was. Again, Master said, almost all the places, and I think this is one of them, are authentic, because Master could see it. This is where it really happened. So I'm going to end tonight's session a little bit earlier than I usually do, because I want to be able to give one more full class. And so this is a better ending point to be able to do that. So now, as we sit next to the table of Christ, being with the fishermen, being with Peter, having his fear mitigated now by the grace of God, having his martyrdom foretold, but after Jesus predicted the way he would die, he said to Peter, "Follow me." So is our commitment to following the ways of God dependent on the belief that he's going to keep us from challenging times? Or is it predicated on the belief that he will take us through whatever is needed for us to become free? So with all that power and thought, we're going to listen to Swamiji chant Master's beautiful chant, "Do not dry the ocean of my love," as we pray next to this rock where Jesus appeared. And then when the chanting is done, this will be the end of our class today.
Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Leave me not, Ma, leave me no more. Leave me not, Ma, leave me no more. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my love. Thee I find behind the fringe of my love. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Leave me not, Ma, leave me not. Leave me not, Ma, leave me no more. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. leave me not more, leave me no more, leave me not more, leave me no more. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. Do not dry the ocean of my love. Do not dry the ocean of my love. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more, hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Leave me not more, leave me not, leave me not more, leave me no more. Do not dry the ocean of my love. 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 Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more, hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Leave me not more, leave me not, leave me not more, leave me not, leave me not more, leave me not, leave me not more, leave me not. Do not dry the ocean of my love. Do not dry the ocean of my love. Do not dry the ocean of my love. Do not dry the ocean of my love with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness, with the fires of my desires, with the fires of my restlessness. For thee I weep, for thee I cry, for thee I weep, for thee I cry. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. I'll cry no more, thou mine evermore. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Thee I find behind the fringe of my mind. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Hide no more, Lord, hide no more. Leave me not to my